So, welcome to this episode of great African women leaders. History has actually really refused to talk about. In the last episode, I was able to provide a background information with regards to at least 18 African women. That is just a minimal number. I mean, it's more than that. So, this episode we will try now to see how we can expand the conversation and I know that the first episode actually received a couple of comments and reviews, and which is actually so very good. And what I'm excited about is that this will also spark a conversation where people will also need to begin to check information for them in this time and age where the internet has created a world library for everybody, so it's easy for people to access information, and that is why you see the kinds of revolution you see even on the African continent and also among Africans, wherever you go. So I'm sure you must have watched them, the first clip, which talks about the disclaimer. This is based on also available resources that we were able to lay hand on, and which are actually readily also available, across many libraries. Libraries, sorry, around the world. So, but basically, the thing is that I want you to take your time, of course, to watch this and also, form, some conversation for yourself. And I believe that you will come to a very good conclusion, like I did, and it will be an exciting moment as well. So let's dive into it and let's see what we have currently. So, if we carry out what we call a comparative analysis of women rulers across the African continent, one of the things that you will find is that historically Africa stands out, and it's actually very interesting that notable rulers, African women leaders are actually people who led their nations, who led kingdoms independently, unlike other continents where the woman is actually kind of like behind some other person, maybe a male figure. And also when you look at also Asia and Europe, although they produced also a couple of influential monarchs, their roles were actually less autonomous, unlike Africa, where the women, when they came in charge or when they are in charge, they take charge of whatever or wherever that they are leading. And so in the case of Europe, it was actually more, symbolic due to, the patriarchal, frameworks that they had. And if you want to analyze this further, one of the things that you'll find is that in terms of comparing the numbers and the nature of such female leaders across, the continents, we'll be focusing more, on queens and rulers who single-handedly governed or, commanded armies, and of course, rather than co-ruling, as it were. So, like I said, in the case of Africa, they were given free hands actually to lead their nations, unlike other continents where they had to actually, will I say, second or actually serve behind, a male figure. So the case of Africa is totally different, and that is why this conversation is important because majorly, you discover that most Africans don't even know the history, as it were, because most of our history were actually destroyed. I mean, like for example, the university actually in Timbuktu, which is a university that people like Aristotle and the rest of them, visited, to understudy a couple of things. Of course, that is no longer in existence, and the library was actually also destroyed. So most of the information that we had with regards to Africa, as it were, was actually wiped off. And so there is not too many, information, with regards to some of the things that women actually, did. So that is why also, this video is actually so very important in terms of having this conversation so that we get to understand firsthand, some of the information of who we are as a people and who we birthed as a people. So there's so much conversation down the timeline for us to learn actually from. So next thing will actually be the summary of of a table of this independent female, rulers, by continent. And so when you look at the African continent, for example, you had people like Ya, Asantewa, you had Queen Amina, you had Cleopatra, you had Nzinga, a couple of them. And so if we look at the numbers, actually, they were greater than 25. So let's spec 25, as the number. And when you compare that, to Asia, you are seeing, female rulers, and these female rulers, like I said, unlike the African continent, were not given free hands to actually lead because of the patriarchal nature, that was existent or existing actually in those places. Now, you are seeing a number of between 20 to 25, approximately. And when you switch over to Europe, you realize that the numbers are approximately between 15 to 20. Now, in Asia, you have people like Wu Zetian, in China. You have Razia Sultana in India. You had Tomiris, you had the Trong sisters also from Vietnam. These are stories that you can actually, get to read, by yourself. And in Europe, you would have seen, someone like Queen Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, Maria Theresa, of course, Isabella, Juan of Castile, and Olga of Kiev, and a couple of others. And so we are in Europe, you're seeing between approximately 15 to 20. Now, in the Americas, you will rather be seeing between approximately between 5 to 7. And so in the Americas, you have, the Anacona, or I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, Lausanne, Toy Purina, and a couple of other people. And in the Oceania, then you will see someone like Queen Kahumano of Hawaii, and also Salato or Salote, Tupo. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrongly. So the approximate numbers are for the Oceania will be between 2 or 3. But whereas on the African continent, you're having greater than 25 different queens. And I'm talking about queens who led, who ruled, who single handedly ruled by themselves. One of the things I'll be talking about in the third episode has to do with this situation, whereby we were told a totally different story. Totally different story. And that is why, whenever you raise this argument with regards to, how, feminism, as it were, may not actually be an African oriented ideology, because before the advent of, the colonial masters, we had, the women leading. It becomes something that, people will begin to argue about. Most especially, a lot of women will argue about it. And I will tell you why there was this deliberate attempt to to shove, majorly the European type of feminism down our throat. We'll be speaking about that actually in the third episode. But with these numbers that you're seeing, it shows to you that Africa has always had a situation whereby we allow, women to take center stage without even questioning their authority. I mean, go back to the Bible times. I mean, Queen Sheba literally came to King Solomon to ask to be, for Solomon to explain to her how to lead her people. And she was from Ethiopia. Guess what? This was even before most parts of the world began to understand anything that has to do with, women leading. And that alone is not even recorded elsewhere alone. It was recorded as well in the Bible and even in the Quran. So that tells you the kind of people that we are as Africans. So it's very important you keep this information, because in the in the third episode, it's going to be very important when I begin to actually also speak with regards to this as well. So, what this necessarily means is that Africa was way, 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 way ahead. And when you look at Africa, Africa was actually way ahead in terms of numerous numbers, in terms of autonomy, and also the exceptional way we also, give, the women, the powers also, to lead and to rule. And it was also more of political and also military wise, unlike most other continents where it wasn't really military, it wasn't really political. And so when you see Hollywood depicting movies, where women actually from Europe or from elsewhere, where fighting wars. I mean, this was something that was existing all over Africa for most African women that they led wars. All right. So this was totally different. I mean, when you compare that also to Africa, so Africa was totally in a class of its own. And so you see people like, Queen Amina of Zazao, she led a military campaign. I mean, it was against even the colonial masters. You had Yao, Asantewa from Ghana, which was also, commanded an entire war under the British, and this happened in the 1900s. And then you have Queen Nzinga, also of Angola. I mean, her story is told, she resisted, the Portuguese with everything in terms of colonization for decades. You had Hatshe Sut, from Egypt. Sorry, I'm pronouncing the names wrong. She ruled, as a pharaoh in full regalia, even adopting male titles. And then you had Teto Betul of Ethiopia, and of course also Queen Sheba. They were, people who led. But in terms of Teto, Betul, she was actually the one that stood against, the Italians, which was the reason why, Ethiopia till today remained the only African nation, which has not been colonized. So you see these people with exceptional characters, people who stood their grounds, who said, you know what, this is who we are as a people. You guys are not changing us. You guys are not doing nothing. Which is why when you see also the advent of, the slave trade and so many things that happened in terms of pillaging the African continent, it was done with so much horror, with so much venom, because a lot had happened over the centuries where not only men were standing up, it was women standing up. Why or how did I even begin to stumble on these facts? While researching on one of the contents that I had made, in terms of the About Women riot, I began to ask myself, why was the British so particular of quelling the About Women riot? That began to help me to begin to question, some situations. So I started asking myself questions, and I started, reading a couple of materials. Lo and behold, I began to stumble on a whole lot of materials, which are not generally talked about in most history, schools, or in most history lessons, across, most African schools. And I feel this is an area that needs to be addressed, by most African schools, most African universities, and, Africans as well, especially the ones growing up, need to be inspired by stories like this, so that they can learn, from who they are and who their past, really, is. So there are a whole lot of women actually who, time will not permit me to begin to reel out all the numbers. I just picked up, a few major, stories that you can readily, get. But also, you also have also oral tradition, which is actually discussed around and across, Africa. So there's a whole lot of information there. And like I always tell anybody or say to anybody, take your time to do your due diligence and work, on research also in that area as well. So, on the other hand, when you look at Asia, as it were, you see long dynasties of empresses, and of course, Wu Zetian in China, and was the only woman, to officially rule, as China, emperor. But also, when you look at Razia Sultana, from Delhi, of course, for India, the Trunk sisters, also who led military resistance, against, the Chinese, Tomiris, and who defeated actually Cyrus the Great. And though, these numbers are not actually as numerous as Africa, but many Asian queens actually held imperial authority or, military power as well, as it were. So, it's one of the things also, that you will actually give also to the Asians. I mean, the Asians also, were following suit, with what, the African women, were really trying to do. So it's just a little bit of a close, number, but not, as much as, that you would have it, on the African continent. So next up will actually be Europe, and Europe, you see the situations of monarchical, power, and of course centralized power. You see the case of Queen Elizabeth I of England, 1533 to 1603, who actually led, the English resistance. You will see Catherine the Great, of course, from Russia, who expanded actually the Russian territory and influence. Maria Theresa, and of course Boudica, and the thing is that despite the male-dominated, political environment, several women, shaped, those nations and also led wars. But one of the things, like I said, is that the African situation is quite so very unique. But why I'm actually giving a bit of this history is that when you begin to do a comparison with regards to some of the things that African women did, you will begin to see a great, great, great difference, and you will really begin to respect some of the things that the women did. Let's go over to the Americas and then see also, in terms of what women also did also in the Americas, as it were. So when you look at the Americas as well, there were few, but they were very fierce. And pre-colonial times, and also indigenous societies, occasionally produce some of those women leaders. And someone like Anacaona, Taino, who resisted also the Spanish colonizers in Hispaniola, and of course Lausanne, and then Toy Purina as well. These are people who led different revolt. And in case of Toy Purina, of course, her revolt was actually against Spanish missionaries. And what I'm trying to bring out from this as well is that you see the disparity when you compare this also with the African women who led our own resistance, who led the resistance, who stood their ground in terms of not bowing down as well. But we just want to cap it up, with the Oceania, and then I will give my 2 cents on what I will have to say to actually close this episode. So, lastly, the Oceania will be the last that we are considering, and with regards to Oceania. Of course, one of the things that you will find with regards to the Oceania is they are rare, but significant. And of course, you have Queen Kamauno, who ruled out Hawaii, Salote, Tupo, the three. Of course, their own authority was actually more of a symbolic, but played a significant role in nation building. So, as much as it was just significant numbers, it was more, in terms of, creating or building, nations. It was more of diplomacy, as it were, in comparison to the African women who would go to war and stand their ground and really, fight it out. So these are some of the things, like I said, the history books are supposed to tell the stories, for the young ones to get to have knowledge of who we are as a people. But like I always say, it seems like a deliberate attempt, to really stifle anything that is going to come up in terms of information, in that nature. But let's wrap this up and see what this whole thing in terms of why these history books are actually kept away from most of us. So first things first, I want to apologize for pronouncing most of the names really wrongly. The names are actually hard to pronounce. So if I ended up pronouncing a name that belonged to your tribe that is really bad, I'm sincerely sorry about it. But Africa has the highest number of documented autonomous female leaders, especially these were women who led militaries. They ruled without co-regency. And what that meant is that they didn't have somebody else, that they had to shadow lead or lead behind a person. They were actually, rulers. I think there was a movie, depicted, by Hollywood recently, which talked about a certain African, woman, who I don't know if it's the one from Dahomey, who, men would literally have to fight, fight to the death for who gets to sleep with her. I mean, that was actually an extreme part of the movie, but she was a very, very powerful figure. Now, not only that, the women also maintained sovereignty, and during imperial or colonial threats, they were the one that stood the ground, that went out to war. So it wasn't kind of like a case like they were being brought in to carry out something. No, and I think there has always been a deliberate attempt to not really explain the stories in detail. And when you compare the numbers, you realize that there are more than 25 or more than 25. In fact, we can't actually count the numbers because some have been lost to history. And rulers, in Africa and of course Asia between, approximately between 20 to 25, Europe between approximately between 15 to 20, and of course other regions are actually fewer. But Africa's historical prominence in female-led government is unmatched. You can't find it on any continent. You can't find it in any group of people. This is not propaganda. This is something that I will advise every single person. If you're an African, go out and watch the uh, go out and research. That's what I will say. Go out and research. After watching this, you can pause any aspect of this material, research, read, dive and read. And of course, one easy thing to do now is that, of course, there are web libraries, across the world where you can access, books. And in the third episode, I will try to actually supply some of the information that I have, in terms of citation, so that you can also be able to look for some of those materials and also get to read. And I will really, appreciate if we can have further discourse, especially in the academia, for people in the academia to really stick to speaking about our women. And that is why in the first episode, like I said, that feminism may actually not have been, an African thing, must have been actually an European oriented thing. Because if you read the history of the Greeks, for example, the women actually remain at home when the men go to war. Whereas in Africa, it wasn't that wasn't the case. Like the women of Dahomey, you can imagine women coming together and going to war. And then, even in our modern times, I think in the 1930s, I mean, you look at the About Women riot. These were women, fighting it out. And they were not actually just playing nice. So, my meaning and what I'm saying in essence is that this is not propaganda. This is what you need to read for yourself. And I love the fact that even of recent, I need just to introduce, a bit of conversation as well, context as well to the conversation. Captain Ibrahim Traore was talking about, our history, which is not actually being talked about. And there's so much rich history that we have that I believe that most of the movie or filmmakers actually in Africa need to depict these movies for the young ones to actually, catch a glimpse of who, they are, who the type of people that they represent. Because when you don't know yourself, you wouldn't actually know where you're going. You wouldn't know where you're going. And oftentimes, there's this narrative that I really hate. I think you also find it in the quote, I mean, at the beginning of the statement, that, when you want to hide something from a black person, put it in a book. But that is not the sincere truth. The fact of the matter is that a lot of history has been annihilated, or removed rather. And it's for us to begin to dig up our histories. It's for us to begin to find out and read up on our histories and get to know who we are as a people. Well, with regards to the rest of the context and in terms of the next conversation, how that is going to be in the third episode, you'll be finding out, some more information in terms of the whole narrative, and that is to also help every individual with more information. And hopefully we can actually create and produce something that is relative to everyone. So, finally, if you find this episode really informative, I will want you to like, share, and of course follow my page, because there is still going to be so much more information I'll be speaking about, apart from even this episode that has to do tentative, just majorly for women. There's still going to be other research work also that I've been working on. But for now, this will be a wrap for this episode, and I'll be seeing you in the or on the third episode. Thank you so very much for watching, and God bless, and do have a fulfilled day wherever you find yourself, African. Thank you.